section of the Year 12 content is looking at post-war divisions and how that was ultimately resolved, leading to Charles I's execution. So Charles was placed under house arrest again after the Second Civil War at Carisbrooke Castle on the Isle of Wight. This was more intentional than Hampton Court's house arrest after the First Civil War, because obviously Hampton Court is on the outskirts of London. It was obviously easy for him to escape and to remilitarise himself. The Isle of Wight is obviously much more isolated and more difficult with which for him to gather any support or momentum into a new army. So Parliament attempted to create a peace negotiation with Charles again, known as the Newport Treaty, and there were several peace proposals put forward to Charles, of which he followed the traditional fashion of rejecting them all, demonstrating the significance and consistent feature of Charles's personality in antagonising relationships with Parliament and the inability to come to any form of agreement. So even though Charles has been defeated twice by this point on two separate occasions, he's still refusing to acknowledge his role within the civil wars itself and of trying to come to some form of compromise with Parliament. We could therefore argue that Charles was ultimately responsible for his own fate due to his unwillingness to negotiate with Parliament. So the army in Ireton declared that Charles had committed treason and Parliament should not be negotiating with a sinner. Ireton formally outlined the position of the army in the 1648 Remonstrance of the Army. So remember, this is now the second remonstrance. The first one was outlined by Pym before the Civil War. And this gave Parliament an ultimatum. Either Parliament must put Charles on trial, or if Parliament refused to put Charles on trial, the remonstrance would purge Parliament and then the King's trial would follow. So as far as Ireton and his followers are concerned, Charles's trial is inevitable now. It has been really since the Second Civil War, and there's this lack of understanding of why Parliament is still trying to negotiate with Charles. However, a parliamentary vote to continue peace negotiations forced the remonstrants to follow through with their threat. So Ireton and Colonel Thomas Pride purged Parliament and took Charles's MP sympathisers to a nearby pub called Hell, and this is known as Pride's Purge. So ultimately, the only politicians who will remain within the House of Commons are those known as Rump MPs, and these are people who are supporters of Cromwell and Ireton, and it then becomes known as the Rump Parliament, and these are the ones who would then ultimately bring Charles I to his trial. This is a really famous propaganda image regarding Charles's incarceration at Carisbrooke on the Isle of Wight, and it kind of signifies his attitude fairly well, in the fact that he is obviously commenting, "Behold your king," whilst behind the castle walls in imprisonment. So Charles very much still thought of himself as divine right of king, that he was in the right, Parliament was in the wrong, and that he still felt he had the cards with which to negotiate with Parliament. And Ireton kind of turns that on its head, saying that he no longer has support and that ultimately Charles's attitude would never change, and that makes negotiation with him impossible, and therefore the only option is to remove him. And this ultimately leads to the regicide. So Charles refused to accept the court's legitimacy, still demonstrating that attitude that he believes he's in the right. And Cromwell was therefore convinced, as well as Ireton, that it was a necessity to remove Charles, as his attitude could instigate further conflict. The country could not sustain a third civil war because of the economic restraint that the civil war had put the country under. So out of 135 commissioners, many of whom did not attend the court, so Fairfax attended once, for example, 59 became regicides by signing Charles's death warrant. So in terms of the key term, you would need to use regicide as opposed to murder or death warrant, because regicide specifically looks at the act of killing a king, not just killing an individual. And as a result of the regicide, Charles was executed on the 30th of January 1649, and we end up with Cromwell acting as a protectorate. So one of the things you need to kind of think of is what caused the Civil War, what caused Charles's execution. And this is where we look at long and short-term factors. So long-term factors are factors that build up over a longer period of time, and inevitably it takes someone to light that match in order to get the spark of the results happening. So if we take the causes of Charles's death, the long-term explanations are the personal rule that he took place for 11 years without consulting Parliament, the absolutism, the tension which existed surrounding his evil councillors such as Wentworth and Buckingham, the relationship with Parliament even before him with James I. However, it is the civil wars and Ireton that kind of light that match which instigates his execution. Short-term factors are immediate causes, what immediately caused that execution, as opposed to long-term factors. Short-term explanations would be his house arrest as a result of the Second Civil War at Carisbrooke Castle, combined with the extremism of Puritans of Cromwell and Ireton, combined with the trial itself, as opposed to the longer-term factors of his historical relationship with Parliament prior to the Civil Wars. So it'd be up to you to kind of differentiate what were the long and short-term causes, and overall what was the biggest cause of Charles's execution, or the Civil War, or any other events as well. So that is the end of Year 12 content. Obviously you'll have a separate pack for Year 13 content to look at what happens when the monarchy is restored, leading up to the final monarchy that you look at under the Stuart period, which is William of Orange and Mary II.